Well, what we're going to be starting today is we're starting a series on giving. Everyone's favorite sermon series is finances and intimacy, if I remember right. That's kind of the two most popular sermon series. So we're just going to be talking about giving today, and we're going to be doing that for about 3 weeks. And the way it's going to work is we're going to start today in the Old Testament, and then Jeremiah's going to take the New Testament next week, and then we'll wrap it all up in the third week. And this morning and next week, there'll be a bit of an overview of things. So if you're really into the Old Testament sacrificial system, and that's something that gets you really excited, I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to go super in depth this morning, but we will go over a bunch of it. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Pastor Jordan. I'm the lead pastor here. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking in Leviticus in particular. So if you want to turn there, you can. We're going to be kind of jumping around. I'm going to be reading out of the ESV this morning. But we're also going to be, you can also open your Bible to Deuteronomy 12. Okay? Those are the two places we're going to be looking at. So if you want to put a little bookmark in Deuteronomy 12 and then open up Leviticus 1, that's where we're going to be starting. So as we talk about giving, though, in the Old Testament, there's some words we need to kind of define so we understand. So we call it the sacrificial system. That's kind of how we define it. And in the sacrificial system, there are offerings. So the idea of offerings and sacrifices, they're not the same thing, but they involve each other. An offering is a fairly easy thing to understand. An offering is a pretty general thing that means like a gift. I'm presenting something to you. And it's the same in Hebrew. It's the same idea. It's a general idea of giving. And, coming out of Christmas, we gave a lot of offerings to each other. Right? We offered presents. We offered food, baking, all that kind of stuff. But not all of our offerings at Christmas were sacrifices. So this is a fun fact for you. There might be a couple fun facts this morning. The word sacrifice comes from a Latin word that means holy and to make. So a sacrifice is to make something holy in its most literal translation. But in our understanding, it kind of means to set something apart, that generally costs you something. Right? That's how we understand sacrifice. And one definition of the word holy is to set something apart. So if we are sacrificing something in an offering, it can mean that we are giving something that might cost us. Right? When Alexis and I were getting married, my mom gave us her mother's wedding rings. Right? That was a sacrifice of hers to give something that was close to her to us. Right? So do you see how that kind of works? Right? There's sacrifices, there's offerings, and in offerings there can be sacrifices. Okay? So now that we're all on the same page and there's no confusion and we all have perfect understanding, we can move forward. That's sarcasm, by the way. So in Leviticus 1 to 5, there are descriptions of about 5 different offerings. In the first 2 chapters, in Leviticus 1, it talks about burnt offerings. And the first 2 chapters talk about like a how-to for all the other types of offerings. Right? So in burnt offerings, you could offer an animal, whether it be a bull, a goat, or a bird. And you could offer these as a way of fulfilling the other offerings, which I'm going to get to. The other option would be a grain offering. You could offer flour. You could offer unleavened bread. You could not offer leavened bread, which is the bread we eat. That wasn't allowed. And in the grain offerings, they often put frankincense as a part of it. And that, when I was reading that, it made me think of our story at the beginning of January with the wise men when they gave the 3 gifts. You know how they gave frankincense as a gift to baby Jesus, right? In Leviticus, you'll see that that frankincense was given in offerings, was the one spice, herb, incense. I guess incense is the right word. And and it was described in addition to everything else as an aroma pleasing to God. So it was something that you would give to God. So when the wise men gave that gift to Jesus, it was one of the church fathers we talked about was saying that it was a symbol of his divinity. Was that it is the same thing that the Israelites gave to God in their offerings. Another cool fun fact for you this morning. But these how-to for offerings were the foundation for three primary offerings. There was a sin offering, there was a guilt offering, and a peace offering. The sin and guilt offerings were ways of dealing with unknown sin and known sin. Right? So the sin offering talks about sins that you didn't know you were doing. I don't know if you've ever tried to read the Old Testament law. There's a lot of particular rules. Right? There's a great show. Have you guys started watching The Promised Land? Okay, it's a wonderful Christian comedy about Moses in the desert. That's done in the style of The Office. So it's like a documentary, and there's a whole section about them learning the law, and it was very comedic because they were like kind of laughing at how particular it was. So it was easy to transgress some of these laws that you may not be familiar with, like maybe if you accidentally wore a polyester shirt, for example, right? That was mixing of fabrics wasn't allowed. So the sin offering was for the unintentional breaking of the law. So you would bring a burnt offering if you had the money, if you had the resources, and that's a really cool thing about the burnt offerings is that the bull was kind of the standard. But if you couldn't afford a bull, you could get a goat, and if you couldn't afford a goat, you could get some birds, and if you couldn't afford the birds, you could offer a grain offering. So there was multiple ways for you to come before God and say, I've sinned, and now I have made a sacrifice, an offering for atonement over that sin. The guilt offering was for more intentional sins, like you purposely did something wrong, and then you would present your offering, and it had the same effect of atoning or covering over your sin. But there's a third category, which is peace offerings. And the peace offering was unique because there was a communal celebration after where they would have a feast. So they would present the food, the animal, the grain, and aside from the fat portion, which was meant for God, and a couple other things, the offerer and the people around them would partake in the animal that was just sacrificed. So it was a big feast. It was a big party. And the idea was it was to emphasize the fellowship or communion of the offerer and God. Like they made peace together. Right? So they were there for communion. And it's a pretty intensive system, right? There's a lot of sacrifice. There's a lot of offerings that were involved, and there's more. But there's one other offering that I wanted to bring our attention to. It was called the daily offering. And when I was reading about it, the dictionary I was reading said that Moses instituted the daily cult. And I just think the cult has the wrong word these days, so I'm just going to say daily offering, because the daily cult we already read out loud together. I think that's enough for some people. So this daily offering was offered every morning and evening, and a 2-year-old lamb was sacrificed along with grain and a liquid offering. And the purpose was, this was done at the temple, and the purpose was that every morning and evening, it was an invitation for the Lord to manifest His presence and to take up residence there. Right? So this is a quick snapshot of the sacrificial system. There was a daily offering to invite God's presence. There was offerings for sin and guilt that kind of culminated in a yearly offering on the Day of Atonement. That was for everybody's sin, that done by the high priest. And then there was these offerings that would celebrate God's a relationship of peace with God, where they would be together and have a feast. And there's some people have put theories behind the sacrificial system, why they were doing these things. And these theories are not in competition with one another, but they complement each other. So the first, theory behind the sacrificial system is that it's a gift. That the purpose behind the sacrificial system was to give God a gift, to honor Him. We see that in Genesis with Cain and Abel. They wanted to give gifts to honor God, to pay Him homage, respect for what He's done. Right? That was the purpose of that gift. And at some level, right, we can think of all offerings or sacrifices as gifts. I think that makes intuitive sense to us. There's another theory of it, is that it was this idea of consecration, right? The purpose of it was to set apart the people, but also the objects for God. So as they sacrificed and gave offerings, they were not only setting the offering apart like the animal, but they would also, through the purification of their sin, be setting themselves apart. Right? So there was this idea of holiness involved. And then the third main theory behind the reason why is this idea of communion, of being in God's presence. Right? So, and what I found really fascinating about this was that the sacrificial system was all, as I was reflecting about it, it was all kind of reflecting God's heart. Right? He wanted to find a way, He made a way for people to get rid of their sins so that they could be made holy and be in His presence. And I thought that was a beautiful picture of what God wants for His people. And central to all of this system was this idea of atonement. I've said that word a couple times. And atonement means, sometimes people say at one-ment, right? The idea that you are one with God. But its more literal meaning is to cover over, right? To cover over sin. There's another interesting usage of the word, and that is to purge. How many of you are familiar with the common saying of a scapegoat? You guys know what that means, right? A scapegoat means that, like, say, you and your brother or you and your sibling do something wrong, and then you have the youngest kid that wasn't there, and you're like, let's just blame it on them because that's easier. They can take all the blame, we'll get away scot-free. Right? That's what a scapegoat is. Someone who you dump the blame on so that they can deal with it and you can be free of it. So, right? That's the idea. And it comes actually from the Bible. It comes from Leviticus, where at the Day of Atonement, the high priest Aaron, when he's sacrificing, making a sin offering for everyone, for all of Israel, 2 goats are brought up. One is chosen to be given to God. The other one, Aaron lays his hands on his head and confesses the sins of Israel. And the sin is then transferred to the goat, and the goat is then sent out into the wilderness. So that's where we get the idea of scapegoat. And that's where this idea of purging comes into atonement, is that the sins of the people are then taken and then cast away into the wilderness or into nothingness. Into chaos. It's gone. That's the idea. That's the imagery of that, which is actually a really beautiful thing if you look to the New Testament, which we'll get to later. Right? But this whole system was designed so that the sins of the people would be dealt with, that they would be sent away, into nothingness, so that God and them could have communion. They could have relationship. And as you read Leviticus, as you read this on your own time, you'll see that there's many lines in there that says when presenting an animal, it had to be an animal without blemish. It had to be like a good animal. It couldn't be, the one that was hobbled and weak and old. And you may be wondering why this is the case. Because if it's going to be burnt up anyway, who cares about its quality? It's going to be gone. But there's this idea under all of these systems of offering and sacrifices, this idea of first fruits. Have you this term you may be familiar familiar with, you may not. It was also its own offering, but we don't need to get into that right now. But the idea of first fruits we can find in Exodus 23:19, and it says, "The best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God." And the idea is that when the people gave to God, it was of the first and the best. So when they would take a harvest, they would set aside, before they did anything with it, they would set aside a portion of that for God. And when they would give to God, they would give to God of the best. And this makes a lot of sense if we look at the story of Cain and Abel again in Genesis 4. The story of Cain and Abel it really emphasizes this point, because Cain gave God fruits of the ground, and Abel gave God the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. Okay, that's the difference in giving. And I was trying to figure out what the fruit of the ground was. It doesn't really say. Some people think vegetables because they're in the ground. I thought of like apples that had fallen off the tree because it's fruit and it's on the ground. But the idea behind it is that it's a thing of convenience, right? And I thought of fruit of the ground when I was thinking of fallen apples. Sometimes you get a good one, right? If you grab it quick enough, but often half of it is good, half of it is rotten, and depending on how hungry you are, you either throw it away or eat half and then throw it. But only take the ones that are on the sidewalk, because otherwise you're stealing people's property. Just a small little tip for you. Right? But the idea behind it is that Cain gave God something that was just around, that was just kind of like laying around here. Not a lot of intention. Where Abel gave him the firstborn of the flock, so one of the most, that would just say that God, what I have, first and foremost, is yours. But then he also gave to him the fat portion. And the reason why the fat portion was valuable was that before modern living, before we had an issue with processed foods and all this stuff, and fat has now become a bit of the enemy. When you were living in a place where you couldn't preserve your food, fat was incredibly valuable. Have you ever watched a show called Alone? Or any survival show? Okay, where people have to go and eat for themselves, fat becomes the most premium resource that you could ever eat. It gives you the most calories, it gives you the most energy, it gives you everything you need in the smallest amount. So fat is like a super survival food. Right? But in our culture, we just think fat is bad because it makes us fat and we don't want it. Right? But back in the Bible times, fat was a premium food. It was a premium survival resource. And so to give God that portion of the animal was to say that, God, you deserve the best of things. So to recap, the sacrificial system was aimed ultimately at atonement. Each offering each offering that was oriented towards sin was for the purpose of purification, so that they could have at-one-ment or communion or peace with God. Right? God was making a way for His presence to be with His people. But this isn't the only system of giving in the Old Testament, right? That's the major one. But in that, there's one that's maybe more familiar with us. It's called the tithe. Have you guys heard of that before? Maybe, right? Do you know what can anyone give me some Bible trivia here and tell me what it means? Tenth, right? A tenth. And here's extra Bible trivia for you. Can anyone tell me where in Genesis we find it? Melchizedek. Yes, absolutely. Abraham gives Melchizedek a tenth. And that story goes, Abraham, his lot was taken in a raid, and Abraham gets together with some other kings and goes and saves his family. And when you fight another kingdom, you take a lot of loot, a lot of plunder. And when they were coming back from their success on the battlefield, Abraham meets this guy named Melchizedek, who is a priest and king of the Most High God. And out of thanksgiving for what God has done, Abraham gave Melchizedek a tenth of all of his plunder. Okay? Which really represents giving God a tenth of everything. And this idea of tithing went forward into the law. And there was three main areas of tithing in the Old Testament. There was a yearly tithe that was in Jerusalem. Every 3 years, there was a tithe to provide for the Levites, for the resident aliens, the orphans, and widows. So in our understanding, that would be kind of like a benevolent offering every 3 years. And then finally, there was a tithe designed to finance the sanctuary, the sanctuary's sacrificial system and its attendance. So there was a tithe, a yearly tithe that was given to God. There was a tithe every 3 years to support the poor and needy, as well as the priests. And then there was a tithe to pay for all of the animals that the offering system required. Right? Because that's a lot of animals. That's a lot of sheep. Right? What's 365 times 2? And whatever that is. That's a lot of sheep. Yeah, perfect. 7-something. 730? There you go. Right? That's a lot of sheep, and that can't be cheap. So these tithes were required for the system to keep going. And the tithing wasn't always money, though, because the tithe that was given every year was of the produce and the crop that you may have had. You could give a money equivalent of it, but ultimately this tithe was not meant to be a burden. It wasn't like a taxes that was on top of everything else. But it was made to be an expression of love and trust, like what Abraham did. Right? It was supposed to be out of thanksgiving for God saving his family member Lot and giving him protection and blessing that endeavor. Abraham offered it out of a heart of thanksgiving. And that's what a tithe is really about. It's a reorientation in the Old Testament. It's a reorientation of someone's heart to say, before I take anything for myself, I'm going to set it aside and give it to God first, to show that He is the provider of all things. Right? That was the purpose of tithing in the Old Testament. Yet, there was another purpose under both of these systems, right? Under the sacrificial system and in the tithing. There's another purpose to this, which is in Deuteronomy 12, verses 4-7. So if you save that, you can turn over to it. And I'm going to read it out of the ESV because and I want you to try and pay attention here to what the purpose of these things are. Okay? Here in Deuteronomy, God is giving, there's instructions on what the Israelites should do now that they are occupying the land. So I'm going to start in verse 3, actually. No, I'll start in verse 2. You shall surely destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars and dash in pieces their altars and burn down their Asherim with fire. You shall chop down the carved images of their gods and destroy their name out of that place. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, but you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put His name and make His habitation there. There you shall go, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the contribution that you present, your vow offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and all your flock. And there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your households, in all that you undertake, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. So, can anyone tell me what is an additional purpose of these systems? You can just say it out loud if you don't need to raise your hand. It's not that kind of classroom. It's worship. Right? The act of the sacrificial system, the act of tithing, the act of giving is a form of worship. And we can see it if we break down the passage that, similar to what we may do here today, we seek God's presence. we go to where his house is. We make sacrifices and atonement for cleansing, right? We don't do that because Jesus did that for us, right? But it was all for the purpose of being in God's presence. And I don't know if you noticed there at the very end, the last line, it says, "And there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice." Because one thing I didn't mention is that yearly tithe that I mentioned, that the people were supposed to set aside the first of everything that they produced that year. That was actually like a peace offering. It was a feast. It was a party, because after they gave God their portion, you know what all that good stuff, we know what it went to? It went to the people that brought it. Right? God said, "Give me your best. Give me the best of your land, of the produce. Set that aside for me, because I blessed you with that." And then God says, "You know what? I want you to partake in this blessing. I want you to experience the goodness that I've given you." And I just thought that was so powerful, because it showed a God who said, not a greedy God who says, "Give me, because I deserve it." But he says, "I want to share in this goodness. Right? This blessing isn't just for me, but I want you to experience the blessings of my presence, the blessings of my provision." Right? And that's what a wonderful thing that we see in all of these systems, is that it was really aimed at the empowerment, the fulfilling of the people. Right? These systems were set in place so that humans could reorient themselves towards God and really experience those blessings. So let's just kind of recap everything. The sacrificial system was aimed at atonement. God made a way for his people to be in his presence so they could experience his goodness and blessings. And the sacrificial system, including tithing, was an expression of worship. By giving of the first fruits of the produce and the livestock, by giving of the best, the offerings and sacrifices and tithes were an act of placing God in his proper place. So then comes a big question. Well, this is all cool stuff. This is all good to know, right? But how is this going to actually impact anything that we're doing? Because we're not under that system anymore, right? Why does this matter? And hopefully you've been able to pull some things out as we have gone over it. But there's two things that stood out to me. The first one is that when I was exploring the Old Testament system, even at a high level, it made me realize God's heart. It showed me a God who cared enough for his people to make it possible for all of them to be in his presence. Whether they were rich or poor, whether they had little or a lot, God made a way in this system for them to come and experience his presence. It also showed me a God who gave back to his people the blessings that were supposed to be set aside for himself. All that good stuff, all the best that we're supposed to give to God, he is generous and says, "I want you to experience in that." And the second thing that really stood out to me as I began to think about this is, how do I worship God with my gifts or through my gifts? Right? Am I really giving God the first and the best of me? Or am I, and Cain and Abel is a great example, am I being like Cain, where I see something around that's convenient and then I give it to God? And I don't want to just put this in the realm of money, because what we give to God, yes, there is a financial part of it, but what's really going on here, especially with Cain and Abel, is the heart posture. So am I really giving God the best of my gifts, the best of me? And I find myself, unfortunately, defaulting to the comfortable, like all of us do. Right? I don't think I'm unique in that. That it's hard to give God the first and the best, because that word sacrifice kind of resonates. We have to give something. So we have to be able to trust that God is the provider, and that, like the tithe, that yearly tithe, that he will actually honor our giving. Like, do we trust God enough as a provider to care for us? And giving is a way of expressing that. And it's a real challenge. Right? And I know the temptation is to think about this primarily in the lens of finances. But when I was thinking about this, I thought of my time with my family. Like, if I I'm out one more night, I'm costing my family. Do I trust that is worth it? Is that cost worth it? And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't, right? You have to be wise in how I use my time, right? Because you could easily burn yourself out and do the opposite of what this is intending to do, right? But personally, I struggle on the side of convenience, where other people struggle on the side of overzealousness. They want to give too much to God, where at the expense of their own well-being. Right? And so there's a balance that we all have to live out here. But ultimately, what we see here is that God's heart for his people is for them to experience himself and all of the blessings and goodness that comes. So as the band comes up and as we sing, I just want us to reflect on that. Are we giving God the best? Are we giving God the first and the best of our gifts, whether it be financial or whether it be personal? Are we living faithfully in that?